So how many of these ultra marathons have you run, or marathons and everything?
So marathons, I ended up only running like maybe 35, 40 marathons. But ultra marathons, I have run 340 ultra marathons.
And these are how long?
So from 50K to 240 miles. But I have run over 100, or I have run 156 of them have been 100 miles or more. And my favorite distance is the 200 miler. But now, so I've run what's called a Triple Crown, and they're the 3 200 milers, Tahoe 200, Bigfoot in Washington, and Moab 240. But next year, so the same organization, Destination Trail Racing, is putting on a 300 miler. It's called the Arizona Monster, and it's on the Arizona Trail. It's sold out in 5 days. 350 other crazy people want to do it as well. So there is no limit to what you can do.
How many days will that take?
They are giving us 9 days, I believe. So I've run 6-day races where I've done almost 400 miles. So.
All right, Catra, I don't even know where to start with your story. Do we start with your childhood, or do we start with where you're at now?
We can start with the childhood.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Fremont, California, which is in the Bay Area near San Francisco. So
You're a California girl.
Yes, lived here all my life. Yeah.
And what was your childhood like?
So I actually had a pretty good childhood. Had both my parents growing up. My father was really into soccer and coaching, and I was kind of a quiet child up until I was like 9. I was like a little bookworm. I was really into dance, and my parents felt like I was too quiet and that I needed to be around more kids, like in groups. So they decided that I should play soccer. So they put me in soccer, which I didn't like, because I didn't like exercising. I didn't like running and all of that.
You didn't like it?
No, not at all. I hated running. So I was played soccer, sat on the sideline most of the time because I didn't, I was intimidated by the other girls because of the age group that I was in. Because of my age and my birthday is in December, I was always like with a little bit of older girls because I guess the cutoff time for the ages for the sport. They were much older than me, and I just felt like they were, I was a little girl and they were more of like in junior high school kind of girls. So yeah, I was very quiet growing up. When I was about 9 or 10, so my sister, I have an older sister that's 10 years older than me, and so she was getting married, and we had a family friend named Steve. He molested me when I was 9 years old, and that changed everything about me as a child. It took away I feel like my innocence in a sense. I became a lot different. I became withdrawn.
It does more than just take away your
It does. It changes you. My parents even asked me, like, did he come into the room last night? And I was so terrified because of what he said to me, like, you better never tell anybody, or I'm going to kill your parents kind of thing. And I just act quiet. When he came in, I didn't move. It's like the typical thing that happens to a lot of people that I've talked to that have been molested. You pretend like it's not happening. And so I had to be around this person for many years after that. It only happened that time. But it really changed me, and it made me afraid. I became more fearful of things. After that, I started having...
It's something you definitely did not want.
No.
How did you allow it to happen, even though you were just a young girl?
He was drunk, and it was after my sister's wedding. I was sleeping in my bed,
you
were?
And he's making threats?
Oh, yeah. He came into my room.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Yeah, that's why my parents are like, did he come into the room? And I was like, no, I was scared. I was terrified to say anything, and I never told my parents until like way later in life. So, and I had to be around him. So I never let myself be alone around him.
How often these kind of people get away
he was
with
around for years after that, and he was even dating young, like when I was in high school, he was, like in his 20s, and he's dating like 16-year-olds, but, this happened when I was 9 or 10. So after that, I mean, I I started having like dreams of dying, being afraid to die, like just weird stuff. I was never afraid. I'd wake up crying and my parents are like, "What's wrong with you?" I'm like, "I don't want to die." I just have these weird dreams of like something bad was going to happen to me because he said like bad stuff would happen to your family kind of thing, I guess. And subconsciously, I just started having these dreams or nightmares of like I was going to die at some point. So after that, though, growing up, I was in like 4-H, where you have animals, and my sisters were in FFA, and this is like where I started my love of animals. And I had sheep, and I was in 4-H, and I didn't know, like, when you raise these animals that somebody was going to buy them and that they slaughtered them to eat them. I didn't know that until I was in the dorm at my 4-H thing at the fair, and I sold my lamb, Roscoe, and this boy came up to me and he said, they're going to eat him. And I was like, what? I was like devastated. So this is like around 10 years old. And I like freaked out. I ran to where he was in his pen, and I stayed in there, and I took off. And so the group supervisor of the dorms was like, "Where is she?" She like disappeared, and called my parents, and they're like, "We don't know where she went." And so my dad's like, "I think I know where she's at." So he came over and he saw me in there, and I was like, they're gonna eat him. They're gonna eat him. And so he told me, he goes, "Oh, no, they're not." And so he had the man that bought him come over to me and tell me that he was going to use him for a stud, which I never ended up asking my dad because he passed away when I was 17, but I think they just told me that, to make me think otherwise. And this kind of story is, I know I talk around a lot, but this is kind of explaining why I became a vegan many years later in my life. So we had 5 head of cattle that my dad worked for the airlines, but he'd buy animals and then, sell them. And, he did a lot of different things. They bought different houses. Like my parents were always doing different things to make other money. So we had 5 head of cattle, 5 steers, and they all got sold except for one. And his name was Charlie. And I used to name the animals. My parents are like, "These are not pets. Those aren't your pets." They lived at the farm. But Charlie, I could like go up to him and hug him, lay on his back, and do all this stuff. And one day I came home, and my brother's like, "Come here." And I was like, "What?" We had a meat freezer in the garage, and he opened it up, and it was full of meat. And he goes, "Charlie's in the freezer." So I stopped eating hamburger at that point in my life. And this is, I want to say I was like 11 when this happened. So my mom would just take like the meatballs out of the pasta or whatever, because I'm like, I'm not eating anything in there. And the same thing when my lamb went away, I stopped eating lamb. So growing up, I was kind of like vegetarian before like I even knew what that was,
Are you still vegan?
I am. So that came later when I got sober. So growing up, so we had these animals. And so after getting molested when I was 9 or 10, I think we ended up moving in between so I went to the same elementary school until 6th grade. And then we moved when I was going into 7th grade to another area in a nicer home. And my sister was already married at this point, and my other sister was, I think she might have had a kid and was out of the house by then. So it was just me and my younger brother and then my parents. So we moved to this new house, and I was going to be going to a new school, and I was kind of still like a quiet child until first day of 7th grade. I remember waiting at the bus stop, and a bunch of girls came up to me to introduce themselves, and it was like the wild crowd. So I went from being kind of a quiet kid to then hanging out with these kind of more, they were, I guess, bad kids. I don't know. They were like smoking pot and stuff like that. And I had 2 older sisters, so I was always trying to feel like I was a little bit older. So I started smoking pot probably, actually, let me backtrack. I started drinking in the 7th grade because those are the kids that I was hanging out with. So we started drinking, and then later I started smoking pot. And my sister, Peggy, who was on drugs at the time, like she was experimenting with drugs, doing acid and stuff. So my friends started doing acid. So I would take acid, but I wouldn't take it. I would throw it on the ground. So I wasn't like up to that point yet. So I was just experimenting with pot and drinking a lot. And I found that I really liked alcohol because then that would make me forget about what had happened to me growing up, you know? So when I would drink to get drunk, and it didn't take much because I was very little. So, and my sister Peggy at the time, she was the one that was doing drugs. So she would get me pot, and her boyfriend was like a pot dealer, I think, at the time. And so he, it's like I would get pot for my friends. And so we were into smoking weed at that time. But like I said, I was more into drinking because that, I would just get drunk and then not remember what was happening half the time. And that went on all through my high school. So my sister at this point, my parents started saying she was having problems. So she had a baby, and then she was married, and she broke up with her husband and started seeing this guy. And at the time, I didn't know she was doing heroin, but that's what she was getting into. And this is like in my 8th, 9th grade year. So she would have me, I would go with her to friend's house, and she would go in. She goes, I'm just going to go run in real quick. And my mom would be like, yeah, go with her and make sure she's not doing anything. And I was young. I didn't know what was going on. We didn't have cell phones back then. So I'd sit in the car, and I'd be in there for like 2 hours, like not knowing what apartment she went into. And then she'd eventually come out, and she was doing heroin at the time. So, but she used me as an excuse to go out of the house and do whatever she was doing. So, yeah, so all through my high school, I started, I was experimenting with drinking a lot. I lost my virginity in between my 7th and 8th grade year because of being promiscuous, because of what happened to me, and drinking. It was like, I guess everybody was doing it, so all my friends lost their virginity, so whatever, So, I drank to get drunk every time I drank, and it wasn't like every day. This isn't going into 9th grade now at this point, but it was on the weekends, and it was like as I got older, it was like I don't remember how I'd get in my house. Like it was that bad, drinking like that, and I hadn't got into harder stuff because now at this point, going into high school, I have this sister that's this addict, and I'm like, that's a drug addict. I'm just smoking pot occasionally. I'm drinking, but that's fine because it's okay to drink, and I started dating different guys, and they were really mentally and physically abusive. And I think that goes back to what happened to me, that I wasn't secure with myself at this point. And I was hanging around with a lot of older friends, like one of my best friends, Judy, who ended up passing away. She got in an automobile accident, right after my dad died when I was 17, and she drank a lot. And she was like the older one with the car and stuff, so we'd go out cruising the Strip. That was the thing to do in the Bay Area back then, and she was so smart. She figured out how to unplug the odometer because her parents would check, her parents worked like a night shift at the automotive car factory in Fremont. And so they would check the odometer, and they're like, okay, you can only go like 6 miles or 5 miles or whatever they would check on her car. But she was so smart. She figured out how to unplug it, and we can go up and down the Strip all night long, like cruising, meeting guys, stuff like that. And so, where am I going with that? So that was like our fun thing to do, and still back once again drinking. And so I started drinking a lot more, dating like horrible people. My father ended up passing away when I was 17, which was pretty traumatic. He died of a massive heart attack at 49. He played sports. He was president of Fremont City Soccer. He ran. He was very athletic, but he smoked, and he did drink. He ate meat, things like that. And his parents lived till their 90s, so it wasn't like something that, it was just something, I guess, that happened. So, and back then, I think with medical stuff now, they would have been able to diagnose it more so, now that he was having a heart condition. So he ended up passing away, and that my brother was with him. So, and boyfriend at the time, when I was 17, who was super abusive mentally and physically to me, He happened to be at my house, and my brother was there, who wasn't old enough to drive, and Joe was 17, and my brother was 15. So my dad's like, oh, the doctor told me to drive over to the hospital. Can you guys drive? Joe, can you drive me? Because I'm having like a chest pain. Instead of saying call the ambulance like you would now. So they drove him. Joe was driving, and my father had a massive heart attack in the car. My brother was trying to save him. He didn't know what to do. And so that changed my brother's life. My brother was this athlete, and then he started drinking. He started doing drugs and all of that. And then there's my poor mom with 2 teenagers that are now, she's in her own grief, but we're getting like out of control, like way out of control. My brother was doing a lot of drugs at the time, and then he went into rehab and got sober. But when he came out, I'm like, can't you just drink? And so I was the bad influence. Like after him being in rehab for 3 months, he's like, yeah, I can drink. So he started doing drugs again, and my mom was really pissed about that. And so he got back on track, and I progressively started getting worse. So my mom's like, you got to do something, because I wasn't going to school at this point. And then I ended up going to continuation school, and I completely changed. I went full on like punk rock, like shaved my head into a mohawk. Like I was like looking pretty normal, and then just went like crazy, and found out about punk music and like all this really cool stuff in England. A friend of mine went to England, so I got into that scene. And so I was going to continuation school, and then I was just like, I got involved with this guy that was doing coke, and he was super abusive, like mentally, physically. I mean, we got in fights. I called the police on him, and I got away from him, thank God. And then my mom's like, you got to do something. You got to get a job. You got to go to school. You got to do something. So I decided to go to cosmetology school. So I went to cosmetology school, partying all the time. I don't know how. I mean, I was so hungover half the time. Like we'd go out. I mean, there was times I went to parties, and then like I would have to figure out how I was going to get home. My friends were too drunk to drive, and I remember walking like 7 miles home in the middle of the night. I mean, I was doing crazy shit. I ended up graduating. And then a friend of mine in cosmetology school, a way that we were making money, we would throw these clubs. So we'd rent out like a hall, and we had a friend that was a DJ, and we served alcohol to all of our friends, and they'd have to pay, like we'd already have it pre-made and stuff. And we'd have like goth clubs happening. So at this point now I was kind of out of the punk rock and more into the goth phase. So we'd make money, and we'd throw these clubs. And he was a lot older. He was like 24, 25, and I was like 19. So we'd have these like cool goth clubs. So it's called the Avant-Garde Dance Palace. We'd rent out this place. So that was our thing. And he was doing, at the time, I started doing speed with him. And I didn't like it. So I did that, very rarely. And I was like, oh, this is not for me. I don't like this. I'd rather get drunk. I don't like this feeling of how you feel on meth. So I graduated from cosmetology school and putting on our clubs. And I met this guy at one of our clubs, Jim. And so I ended up getting a job in San Jose, and I moved in with him and his mom. And he was, let's see, how old was I? I was 20 at that time, and he was 18. So I moved in with him at his mom's house, and his mom was an alcoholic, so always had booze in the house. He was an alcoholic, and I was able to drink, but I had a job. I was working at a hair salon in downtown San Jose. So that relationship was horrible too. Another abusive person. Mentally, physically, said I was ugly, I was fat, and then I started having these body image issues with myself, and off and on. And so we were together off and on until, let's see, from the time I was 20 to 25-ish. And it was just like, he was cheating on me all the time, and then I'd cheat on, I'd go out on him, and we would live together off and on, and it was just a horrible, horrible relationship. So at the time, I met this guy, Jason, who I didn't know at the time he was a meth dealer. And So, and I was totally against meth. Like, my friends would do it. I'm like, that's so gross. I can't believe, at the time, I'm like totally against it. So my friends were telling him, like, don't tell her that you do that, because she doesn't do that. And so a good friend of mine who was, I guess she had cheated with my boyfriend, Jim, at the time, told me that. I'm like, great. Now I can break up with him. That's my excuse, because I was cheating on him with somebody else. So he came to a restaurant that me and this girl, Michelle, who had told me that she cheated on him, and he knew we were going to be at this restaurant because I broke up with him, and I'm going out with Michelle for dinner. And then he came in there yelling at her, calling it a whore and all this stuff. And so we ended up breaking up right there. And then I got together with this guy, Jason. And I moved into his house with him and his parents. His parents were alcoholics. They'd get drunk every single weekend. They had jobs, but on the weekends, they were like belligerent, And they had this little wiener dog. And everybody that knows me knows I have dachshunds now. But I was terrified of this dog. So it would like blind, deaf, come at me, like try to bite my ankles. And I was like, fearful. So at some point, I found out, like Jason's going in and out of the house, like all the time. People are coming, and I didn't know at the time he was doing meth or dealing meth. And finally, at some point, one of my friends came over, and she told me that that's what he was doing, and I was like, oh, okay. At that point, I didn't care. I was like, I want to try it again and see. Like, so we went out. We were really into going to the goth clubs. So, and he was in a goth band too. So I did it, and I was like, okay, that's fun. So I started doing it on the weekends, just to be able to go out dancing all night and have fun like that. And then at some point, me and my friend were going to a concert. It was Lollapalooza, I think. It was Jane's Addiction. It was the first one they put on. And I felt like crap. I had done meth for 2 days, and I would only do it on the weekends. I was managing it. And I felt so crappy. She goes, if you just do it right now, you'll feel better. And it was like, I've never did it 3 days in a row. So I did it, and from that moment on, I became doing it, addicted. I remember distinctly, like, I felt so much better. And I'm like, oh, I don't ever have to feel like I have this, like, weird hangover. And I started doing it every day. And I had a job. I had a car, I had things, and that takes you down pretty quickly. Like, within a year's time, I lost my car. All my credit cards were maxed out because of living with him and him having no job and me paying for everything. I still had my job. I was still working in a hair salon, but he was shooting it up, and I didn't know that at the time because he would act super crazy, like, crazy. And I was acting crazy at the time because obviously, like, you start getting into that psychosis, which you believe, like, you're seeing things, you're hearing things. So he'd go off, and, if I didn't go out that night and he'd go on his own, I would hear, like, I swore I was hearing helicopters and the police were watching us. And, I started getting those weird, things because I was doing it so much. And I was so addicted. This is funny. A lot of people laugh when I tell them this. He would give me a certain amount of meth to do every day. Well, I was doing it, all of mine. So I'd buy more. I'd say, oh, I want to buy, a quarter for somebody. So I was buying meth off of my boyfriend for me so I could have more, because that's how bad I was in. And at one point, he wanted to quit. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, quit? Why do we have to quit, And that's when I truly knew I was an addict. But I still, at this point, my sister was really heavily into her heroin addiction. And I was like, oh, I'm not putting a needle in my arm. I'm not a heroin addict. That's an addict. Like, I'm better than that. I have a job. I'm, going out clubbing, having fun. Like, she's like, that's a drug addict. I'm not a drug addict. So, but he wanted to quit for like 2 days. That happened. And that was it. And I came to a realization, like, I guess I'm going to live like this forever. Like, there was a point when I was like, this is what I'm doing, and I'm okay with it. I'm going to be a goth all my life. I'm going to be going out to the goth clubs all the time. And this when I was like 26. I'm like, I am not changing. I'm going to be with my long black hair, my white skin. I am not changing. I'm going to be listening to this music forever and hanging out with these people. So and my mom didn't know I was doing this, so I was kind of hiding it from her, but my drug addict sister was like, she's on something, look how skinny she is, and my mom's like, you don't know what you're talking about, So at one point, we were selling to our friends and stuff. We weren't like big time dealers, but a friend of ours got arrested, and he didn't turn in the bigwigs. Let me backtrack. So I was hanging out a lot in LA. We were going to all these goth clubs, so we drive for the day. Like, we drive up in the morning and get to the club at night and go to the club and then do meth all night and then drive back like that. And that was like our weekends, coming back and forth to LA doing, meth. And all the cool goth clubs were here. So that's why we hung out a lot here. So anyways, this guy gets arrested, and he calls me up to do a buy over the phone, and he's like, oh, I want to buy something. Are you going to be around? And I said, yeah. And Jason was asleep because he had been awake for 5 days. And so I'm like, sure, come on by. And he never showed up. And I was like, oh, that's weird. He didn't show up. Well, like 2 days later, it's like an episode of Cops. So my boyfriend's parents are watching a Niners game, and they're like screaming at the TV like they did, when they're watching their sport things. All of a sudden, the cops come banging on the door, push the door open, and they're like grabbing everybody in the house. They're like, where's Jason? Where's Catra? And I'm like, I'm Catra, and Jason's passed out in the room. And so they handcuff all of us, even his parents. And his parents are like, what's going on? And they're like, we have a warrant here, this house, they're selling drugs out of here. And so they went in the room, and then Jason showed them where everything was. And they came to me, and they're like, you're Catra? Because they had a description of somebody totally different, because he didn't want to say what I looked like, when I did the sell over the phone. And I said, yeah. So, and they completely tore apart the house, and they realized the parents had no involvement in this. So they're kind of like, okay, just show us where everything is. They were going through every room and all of that. And then they finally said, okay, we're taking these two in. They're cooperating. So I get in the back of the cop car with this cop, and I'll always remember this. He goes, what are you doing with your life? You have a job? You're, like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I don't know, like, he was like, this is no way for somebody to live. And I thought, yeah, but this is my life now, So they took us to jail, and I spent like one night and like 2 days basically in jail, and I was scared. So I get into this cell. Oh, let me backtrack. See, I go off the handle. So I was dancing in all these goth clubs, and a friend of mine was a stripper. So she's like, you should, come and try out. So, and I ended up going to this strip club and started working there because I was like, I could get paid to dance. I go to the nightclubs and I dance. So I did that for like 5 months and was making money doing that. So that was like another side hustle that I did. So, but anyways, back to getting arrested. So I'm, doing all that stuff, and I'm in this jail cell because I'm scared at this point because now I'm like, oh my God, I'm still spun, been awake for a few days, but I'm getting scared, like I'm going to be in here forever, So I go, don't I get to go home? The cop said I was going to go home, that I was just going to and they're like, you're not going anywhere. You're going to be in here for a while. You're getting charged with, drug dealing. And I was like, oh my God. So I'm in my cell looking in the little like mirror thing. It's not even a mirror. What is it? Like a sheet metal thing that looks, kind of like a mirror. And I'm looking at myself and I'm thinking, how did I get here? Like, when I came from where I came from, how did I get here? Why am I here? Like, what am I doing with my life, So it scared me being in jail. It terrified me. Like, all I thought it was like about these horrible people that are in jail, like I'm going to be stuck here and I'm going to have, my life is over. So the next day, I ended up getting out, and then I have to go, to court, and I'm on drug diversion. So what Jason had did is he took all the blame. Even though I had did the sell over the phone, I had a job, I had never gotten in trouble before, and he had been in trouble before. He had like a warrant out for his arrest and stuff like that. So I talked to my public defender, and he's like, you might get lucky. They usually charge, if it's, the couple, they charge them the same. But because you've not been in trouble, and you may get like a lighter sentence, and you may get drug diversion if that's what the judge decides. So the judge decided that, yes, I can get like an outpatient program. Since I had a job, I had to go to NA every single day, 5 days a week, do drug testing. I think I was going 3 times a week to get drug tested, and do an outpatient program. That saved my life, to be honest with you. I didn't think I would ever want to get sober, but like when you're faced with that, it's crazy. When I got arrested, like right when I got out of jail, and Jason ended up getting out of jail before sentencing, people were already calling us, when are you going to sell drugs again? Like, that's the crazy people we hung out with, and that was, the involvement. Who would think that? Like, you're going to sell drugs. You just got arrested. You're going to start selling drugs again. I got my drug diversion, and Jason ended up having to go to jail for 6 months. He ended up doing 3 months, and then got house arrest for 3 months. But since I had never been in trouble, I got into this outpatient program, which was a whole nother crazy. People are like, what are you doing to make your drug tests clean? And I was like, well, I'm peeing in a cup and I'm not doing drugs. Like they had all these things that they were doing, and they wanted to know why, how I was doing it, because they weren't doing the program. It was crazy. I'm in this, group meeting thing, and, before the counselor would come in, I was just like, wait, none of these people in here are doing it. They're still on drugs. They're still trying to beat the system or whatever. And I went with it. I was like, you know what? I'm going to do this. I don't belong here. I know there's something, there's a higher purpose in my life. So the biggest thing that made a difference for me, so I was going to the NA, and I just felt like I couldn't even talk, because the people there had bigger stories than mine. I was like this white girl, these are gang members in there, because I'm in downtown San Jose going to Narcotics Anonymous, and these guys have been in prison. The majority of them, they've had these really crazy lives, and I was like, God, I don't even want to tell my story, because I feel so bad, like you're nothing, you didn't do anything wrong. But listening to those stories, it was impacting me, because I was like, that could be me. That's where I could be going. I could be heading down that direction. But I had this therapist that I started seeing, and I would say that changed me the most. I was able to talk about my sexual abuse. I was able to talk about like all the, the horrible relationships that I was in, and talk about the why, because we don't, as, kids, you don't grow up saying, oh, I want to be a drug addict. Like, I think that's what I want to do in life. So once I addressed everything that was happening in my past, and why I was choosing the direction I was going, it made sense. And I was able to tell my mom, and that was the biggest thing for me, was being able to tell her what had happened. And she's like, why didn't you ever tell me, typical thing. And I was like, I was scared. I was a kid, and I said, but I'm telling you now. And, that changed me. That's why I probably chose all these things that I was doing that weren't good in life, and, being promiscuous and going down the wrong path in life. So I had that therapist. She was her name was Camille. She was amazing. And
what age were you?
I was 27.
So still pretty young.
27, 28, 29, 30, 20, 28. Yeah. So I was still young enough to I was only using drugs for a couple of years, but the alcohol was the bigger issue. So when I did go to drug diversion, I was like, oh, that's cool. I could still go to the clubs and drink. So I didn't realize until I went to my second court meeting, they're like, no, you can't even drink. And I was like, what? Like, what? Because I was still kind of trying to go to the goth club. But it was like, when I got there, I was like, what am I doing? This isn't, like my eyes, like I was seeing everything for the first time going, why was I hanging out with all these people? Like they're all negative. They're like dark. They're, and we were black and white, But I was like, yeah, this isn't me anymore. And so I had to isolate myself, and I was still with the boyfriend at the time. And then we ended up breaking up because I was like, I attempted suicide. So let me backtrack a little bit. So after I got sober, I was like, I can't do anything. He was in jail, and I was like, I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to be here. I'm gonna end it. At that point, I hadn't told my mom yet, so I hadn't moved back home to where I had to tell her. And I'm just like, I don't want to be here anymore. I just want to give up. I'm not happy. I'm depressed. And so I took a bunch of pills, and I realized, so at the time we had this other little wiener dog named Dee Dee, and I just laid on the bed. I'm just like, I'm going to go to sleep. I don't care, And she came and she started licking my face, and I was like, what did I just do? Like, it dawned on me, like, do you really want to die? Do you really want to stop living at 28? And so I called 911, and they took me in. They 5150 me. They pumped my stomach, put me. I was on a hold for they didn't make me stay for 72 hours. They just made me stay for 2 days because they realized, they told me too, you can't go back to that house. You can't be around him. You can't be around that family. They go, the only way we're going to let you go is if you go to Fremont, to where your mom lives. So that's when I had to end up telling my mom all this stuff. And she was just like, what are you doing? So, and then I told my therapist, Camille, and she's like, yeah, you need to get away from that family. It's very toxic. He's toxic. Like, you got to work your program on your own, and he can do his program on his own, And I realized he wasn't somebody I would want to spend the rest of my life with anyways. So, but being able to get a therapist was the biggest thing. I mean, I worked my program. I kept clean and sober, wasn't doing drugs. And now I'm moving back home. I'm living in Fremont. I have like one friend, my friend Kevin. He smoked pot, and that was it occasionally, but never around me. And we were doing like fun stuff together. And I started walking. We were going to the gym, so he like worked out. And so I joined a gym, and I'm like, okay, I got to do something else here. And I started walking. So I was walking with my dog like 3 miles a day, going to the gym. And then I got bored. I was like, I think I'm going to try running. I think I'm going to run around the block. I run around this 3 miles. So, and this is before GPS fancy watches. So this is 1996. So I got in my car because I kind of knew. I was like, oh, it's probably like 3 miles, but I wanted to know for sure. So I got in my vehicle, and I pressed the odometer, and I drove, and I was like, oh yeah, it's like 3.2 miles that I've been walking with my dog. So I decided to run it. So I ran 3 miles, and I was like, wow, I ran. And I was, mind you, hated running, hated anything to do with running. Oh, let me go back to high school. So for PE, I got an F because I wouldn't dress. I refused. I'm like, I am not getting sweaty. I am not walking around the track. I am not doing the physical fitness challenge. I'm not doing any of that. That's like in 10th grade before I went to the adult school. To the continuation. So yeah, who gets an F in PE? Me, because I refused to do anything. So I ended up running, and I was like, wow, that was kind of fun, So like 7 to 10 days later, I saw this flyer inside of a Barnes & Noble's, and it was for a 10K race. So I was like, oh, 10K, that's 6 miles. I think I could do that. So I told my mom, I said, hey, you want to do the 5K walk? I want to sign up for this 10K race. So we both showed up. She did the 5K. I did the 10K, ran super hard and fast. I was still like in my goth phase, wearing all black. It was super hot, black hair and all of that. And I was like dying when I was finished. But I felt the sense of accomplishment. Like, I had no purpose before. It was like just doing things, like working out. Oh, and when I got sober, I had been a vegetarian for many years. And me and one of my friends, when we were on drugs, we were like, oh, we should become vegans, vegans for the animals. And, we're not wearing leather. We're not wearing, So right when I got released from jail, that same day, I became vegan. So in June 24th, it'll be 30 years. So I became vegan and got sober on the same day. So now my running thing. So I felt like I had a purpose. Like there was something, there was a spark I was passionate about. Like I was passionate about getting my drugs and going to my club and doing drugs. I was like, I found something that I could do the same type of thing, but in a good way. So when I finished that 10K, on my vehicle, there was a flyer for the San Francisco Marathon. And it was in 3 months. And I've just been running a couple of weeks. And I'm like, okay, I don't know anybody that runs. I'm going to go to Barnes & Noble's and look for a book on a marathon, how to run a marathon. So find myself in Barnes & Noble's, get this marathon training guide. And I'm like, okay, let's see. I got 3 months. So I skipped to the chapter. I didn't even read anything else. I'm like, okay, 3 months before your marathon, you have to run 9 miles on Sunday. So I've been running like 3 to 5 miles a day now at this point, and then I'm like, okay, I got to figure out how far 9 miles is, get in my little car, push the little button, drive 4.5 miles out. I'm like, okay, the gas station. There's a gas station there, so I know when to turn around. So that Sunday, I went out, ran my 9 miles, came back, and I started feeling that runner's high, I guess. I felt so good. I'm like, okay, now I have a purpose. I have a plan. I have a direction. I'm training for this marathon. So trained for my 3 months. And there was this like path in Fremont that was 22 miles, I believe, on the canal or on the Alameda Creek. And so I decided before my marathon, like 22 miles, I think was the most miles I was supposed to run. Well, I decided I was going to run 26 miles before I did my marathon as my last long run 3 weeks before, because I wanted to know how I was going to feel. So I did this 26-mile run, felt fantastic, and I'm like, okay, now I'm ready to go. So I did this whole carbo loading thing, kept my legs up, like the day before. I was like so fanatic about this. I'm not even like that now about my running. But I'm like, I got to drink all this water, got to, carbo load, and so comes marathon day, so I get dropped off by my friend Kevin. And had we started dating yet? I think we were dating at that time. So he drops me off, and I'm at the start, and we get to go over the Golden Gate Bridge. And I'm really excited because now we're going to go through all these places where I used to go to clubs at. So we're going through the Tenderloin. We're going all around, San Francisco, 26 miles, and finishing at the park, Golden Gate Park. And so it's race day and I'm running, and I got at the time I was in school. I went back to school to get my high school diploma because I never had graduated, and I decided I wanted to go back. Instead of just getting a GED, I was going through the adult school. So at the time I was working at Noah's Bagels, and there was these one young guy that worked there, and I ended up convincing him. He was like 17, and he ran track though too. But he just like signed a waiver from his parents, like saying he was going to run a marathon. He was graduating from high school, and his friend who was in college signed up. These are all like the day before the race they signed up because I convinced him. So we're like running, and his friend took off, and I was running with him. And his friend was the one who wasn't trained, and the other guy had been running, track. And so we ran together for a while, and then I ended up dropping him. And I'm running with this man, and we're going through Chinatown at this point. And he had run a bunch of marathons, and he was telling me his story of his marathons. And he goes, oh, is this your first marathon? And I said, yeah. I said, but I'm going to run Honolulu Marathon in December. I'm going to go to Hawaii. And he's looking at me, and he's like, you haven't even finished this marathon. And I go, well, I just figure I want to run a marathon in Honolulu in Hawaii. So I ended up finishing, and at the end, I kept waiting for this whole thing. They say that, you're going to hit the wall. And I'm like, okay. I didn't feel like I hit a wall when I ran my 26 miles, on the trail. On the canal. And so I get like to mile 25, and all of a sudden my legs did feel like lead. And then you got to run in the stadium, and everybody's cheering for you. And so I'm like, okay, just legs go, So I'm running in the stadium, and my mom's waiting for me, and my brother's there. And, I when I got to that finish line, I just felt like, oh my God, I did something amazing. That was like the biggest thing I ever did in my life. And for me to go from non-runner, non-athlete to finishing a marathon, I just, I felt like I was like this famous athlete, coming into the thing. And my mom couldn't believe it. My brother, who was a runner, couldn't believe I ran a marathon, And so my legs completely shut down after that. So then then I ran the Honolulu Marathon, and then I decided I'm going to run every marathon in California. And I had nobody guiding me. There was no internet really back then. No, there wasn't. So there was internet, but not like it is now. So there was, no Instagram and social media where you can find out information about stuff. So I just decided I'm going to run these marathons in California and started running all these different marathons. And there was too many of them for me to run all of them at the time. So I was running as many as I could. And some of them were like back-to-back weekends. So I was sometimes doing a Saturday and a Sunday marathon. So then it came to like the first time I was going to run a trail marathon, because some of these were on trails. And I was like, oh my God, I got to do a trail marathon. So I had to buy it said you needed a waist pack with a bottle. And I'm used to like every mile you got like a water stop and things like that. So this was going to be all new. So we showed up to this race that I was going to be running. It was pouring rain and it got canceled. So the race director's coming up to the vehicles that are there for this trail race at the Golden Gate Headlands. And he's like, we're postponing it. The park said we had to cancel it. So it's going to be like in another month. So, and my mom's with me, and she was all the way there. She's like, you're crazy. You're not going to run in this rain. You're not going to run in this rain. And I'm like, yeah, it's, the race is going to happen. So it didn't happen. So we're driving home. And this is just telling you, kind of showing you my personality. It's nuts. So we get home, and I'm thinking the whole time I'm driving, I'm like, I'm going to run a marathon today. And I already had a 13-mile loop that I used to do, as my training, And so I'm like, I'm just going to run my loop twice today. And my mom's like, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm going to get some of my stuff together. I'm going to run a marathon right now. And she goes, are you kidding? It's raining out. And I go, I don't care. I was supposed to run a marathon today. I'm going to run a marathon. So I did that. So then comes a month later, and the marathon happens on the trail. And this is my first introduction to trail running, which was a whole nother thing. I was like scared because I'm like, am I going to get lost? Now there's like markings, ribbons. Like I'm used to just going on the road, following the thousands of people. And there's not thousands of people here. There's maybe 50 of us, 40, I don't know. There was 2 different distances, but there wasn't a lot of people. And so you got to follow the markings. So I'm like nervous. I'm like, okay. So you got water about every 5 to 6 miles. And then they had like some cookies sitting out with bananas at a table, like at one of the trailheads. So I finished my first loop, and it's all technical, and I'm not used to I'm used to roads, so I'm like very scared. I'm like, I'm going to fall, and I fell a few times. So I get to the start finish, and then I get ready to go back out. My mom's like, you're not done. And I'm like, no, I have to go one more time. So I did the second loop and then finished. And I thought that, after running a bunch of marathons and just doing road stuff, I was like, this is pretty cool. I go, that was pretty scary for me to be on a trail. But I'm like, I think I kind of like running on the trail. And in that race, I had met this older gentleman, and he was running all these marathons in California, and he had run marathons in all 50 states. And he was actually off course, and I was like looking at the ribbons. I'm like, hey, I think you're supposed to be over here, because I saw him with a number, and he's like, oh, thanks. So we kind of ran that last loop together, and we started seeing each other at other races, and I started hearing people around me as I'm running these marathons talk about ultra marathons, and I was like, what is that? What are they saying? And then I'm like, oh, I remember watching a 100-mile race, the Western States, which was the oldest one and the first one, with my dad on TV, because my dad always watched Wide World of Sports, and he was really into running. They're running from Squaw Valley at the time to Auburn, and I was like, I used to play soccer in Auburn when I was forced to play soccer. So I was like, oh yeah, whatever, But I remember hearing that thing, Western States and ultra marathon, kind of in the same sentence. So I asked this person that was running near me, I'm like, hey, I go, how far? Because I had heard of the 100 miler. She goes, oh, it's like 50K is 31 miles, 50 miler, 100K is 62 miles, and then 100 milers. And I was like, oh, I think I'm going to do one of those. I'm going to do a 50K. And I kind of looked and found out that there was one close to my home. And it started in Fremont. It went over Mission Peak. At this point, this is this big peak in Fremont. And I hadn't been up it yet. And I was like, okay, I should probably go check it out. And I asked my friend from work, I'm like, hey, how do you get up there? Because I hadn't been running trails by myself. I ran the trails that I ran on was like along the bay, and it was like close to home, and it wasn't like, oh, you can get lost. You're like in the wilderness. Well, this is more wildernessy. So he told me how to get to the top, and I went up and I did a run up to the top and came down. I was like, that was freaking hard. And it climbed up to 2,600 feet. And, and the trail marathons that I had done, we didn't do a big peak or anything like that. I was still running in the headlands, but I was not as crazy. So I called the race director up and I said, hey, I'm interested in signing up for your race. And he goes, oh, have you run an ultra? And I said, no. And I said, but I've been up Mission Peak. He goes, yeah, this is more for advanced people. He goes, if you haven't been running trails, it's a really strenuous race. And at the time, it was one of the hardest 50Ks in California because there wasn't that many races. And he scared me. So he's like, you should do Skyline 50K in Castro Valley. And, it's a mellower route. And he goes, and then maybe, next year do this one. And I was like, oh, okay. So, and later I'll say why. I'm glad I didn't do that as my first one because I may have never wanted to do another ultra again. So anyways, I do the Skyline race, and it's like 105 degrees. I know nothing about how to eat, and in a longer race, nutrition is very important, and drinking, electrolytes. I was just drinking water in a marathon, I was done in, under 4.5 hours, and this thing I'm going to be out for like 5.5, 6.5 hours. So, and with lots of climbing. So it's 105 degrees out, hottest day of the year in this course. And it starts going, around this reservoir, and then it starts climbing. So I'm like running all the hills, and I see all these people walking, and I'm like, why are they all walking the hill? And these guys are like, hey, is this your first ultra? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, you should be walking the hills. And I was like, I'm a fucking runner. Why am I going to walk the hills? So I'm running everything, and I get the last, I want to say 6 miles from the finish, I was dying. It was so hot, and now I can hardly run. And all those guys, older guys, are passing me. And I'm like, fuck, all these old men are passing me, and I can hardly move. My legs are so heavy, and I'm exhausted, and I'm dizzy, and I'm nauseous. And so anyways, I get to the finish line. And, one of the guys comes up and he's all, I told you should be walking the hills. And I was like, whatever. So I finished, and my mom was at the finish line. And I was like, wow, I can't believe I did an ultra. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to do a 50 miler that's happening in 2 weeks. So, I'm trained. I did this 50K. So I'm like, okay. So once again, here, it's in the same area. So I'm like, okay, cool. 50 miles, Well, 50 miles is a lot further than 31 miles. So I start the race and, following everybody, and I still don't know much about nutrition. And so I was kind of learning on the fly there that, I'm eating little bits and pieces of banana and things like that at the aid station. And then I'm getting stomach issues because I don't know to take salt pills and all of that. So anyways, I finish, and it was a struggle. There was not any time that I thought of giving up, but I kept thinking of my dad, who was a runner back then, and I was thinking, how proud would he be to see his little girl doing this crazy shit, out here. So I got to the finish line. My mom once again was there at the finish, and she's like, I cannot believe you ran 50 miles, And so 2 weeks later, there was another 50 miler. So I'm like, okay, I want to do this one. And it was in Napa, once again, horrible weather. So the race director tells us at the start, the ones that, because they had a 50K, 50 miler. So the 50 miler started like an hour ahead of the 50K. He goes, I'm just letting you all know, the weather's going to be really bad. After you finish your first 50K, you don't have to go back out. If you want to drop down, you can get credit. And instead of getting what's called did not finish, he was allowing us to drop down because of the conditions of the race. So if you got back to the start and finish, you didn't have to go out and do this other loop, So it's pouring rain, and I'm in the middle of this thing, and it's like muddy. I hadn't run in this on a trail in this sloppy conditions before. So I'm running with this guy, and he had run hundreds of miles before, and I was like, if I finish this, we had run like 10 miles. And I'm like, if I finish this, I'm running a 100-miler. He goes, just like that? And I go, yeah, I've done 2 50-milers and a 50K in the last few months. I said, couple months, I'm going to run a 100-miler. And he goes, well, you should do a little more training. But I didn't listen to him. So anyways, I get, past the first point where I could drop down, and I said, nope, I'm going to keep going. So it ended up the last 3 miles, it got sunny. It was beautiful. I finished. I was last because a lot of people dropped down. And there was only out of all the people that started, I think there was 40 people that started the 50-miler. There was only 12 of us that finished. And I was the last one, but I didn't care. I finished, got home. And at this point, I had this magazine called Ultra Running. So that's how I started knowing all the races. And I was like, okay, when's the next 100-miler coming up? And it was in February. And I was like, I'm signing up for Rocky Raccoon. So I sent my little check-in. That's how you did it back in the day. Mailed it in. Signed up. Didn't know anybody that, at this point, I'm still not hanging out with runners. I'm just showing up at races. I had met that guy doing marathons, but he lives in Southern California. I lived in the Bay Area. So it's now almost 3.5, 4 months since I started running ultras. I'm at the start line in Huntsville, Texas for Rocky Raccoon. It was humid. I hadn't dealt with humidity before. And it's in February, and it ended up being 80 degrees out. And so I didn't know I should be wearing a bigger shoe. I didn't know any of that yet. I hadn't read about all of that. So I made my little drop bags with snacks and things I wanted. So I get 60 miles into the race, and I have these awful blisters, horrendous, where they had to pop them. So I take my shoes off, and my boyfriend Kevin at the time was there, and he's like, okay. He goes, are you going to stop? And I'm like, no, I'm going to get my feet taped up and keep going. And then he went to go see where JFK was shot or something. He went off. He was on his own journey out there. So I get my feet taped up, and I'm like, I'm going to do this. I can do this. So I go back out on my next loop because it was 20-mile loops, and I get back into 80 miles, and my feet are killing me at this point. I'm like, it feels like somebody's just taking a lighter to the bottom of my feet. So they went to take the tape off the back of my heel, and at this time people were using just duct tape. Okay, that's how long ago. And the guy went to rip the tape off, and he ripped my skin, and I'm like, put that back on. I'm like, no. So I ended up just having him tape the ball of my feet. I'm like, don't pop these things, just leave them. I got 20 miles to go. So I head out, and it's nighttime, and I'm getting super sleepy. And at the time, I didn't even drink coffee because I figured that was a drug. I didn't take Advil. I was such a straight edge, vegan person, not doing anything. And I don't feel that way about coffee now. But that was how my recovery, my brain was you can't take a caffeine pill because that's a drug. That's doing speed. So I'm falling asleep, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to get to the aid station, and I'm going to have a half a cup of coffee. And I'm with this woman. And she's like, do you want a no-dose? And I'm like, oh, absolutely not. That's speed. I was thinking in my head. I didn't say that to her, but I was just thinking that. I'm like, no, I'm going to try to get a cup of coffee. And I was weaving, and she saw it. She's like, okay. And we get to the aid station, and I'm like, do you have any coffee? And they're like, no, we don't have any at this aid station. It's at the next one. So she convinces me. She's like, take the no-dose. She goes, just break it in half. It is literally 200 milligrams of caffeine. It's like a cup of coffee. But, in my head, I'm like, oh, no. And I was like, okay, I'll take half of one. So I took half of it, and within 15 minutes, I was awake, and I was stumbling, falling down, falling asleep, stumbling. And then I just take off. I'm like, bye, and left her. And so ended up finishing, stumbling in, my feet were messed up. I was a wreck. I couldn't even walk for 3 days. So I finished this 100-miler. And Kevin goes because we had a fly out that same night. And I had forgot the big thing is you get these belt buckles at these 100-mile races. And why that is so Western States was the very first 100-mile race, and it's in the one that goes Squaw Valley to Auburn. And it used to be it was a horse race, and it still is. Well, this guy one year decided to run it, and his horse was having issues, so he ran with the horses, and that's what the cowboys got, or the horse riders, the ride and tie people, were belt buckles. So that's why we get belt buckles at these 100-mile events. So in case anybody needs to know. So I forgot my belt buckle after I finished. I didn't, and I sent Kevin. I'm like, Kevin, can you go back and get my belt buckle? That's like why I ran this. I wanted this freaking belt buckle, to show that I'm a 100-mile runner, So he leaves, and I take a bath, and I'm crawling at this point. I cannot stand up. My feet are swollen. They're all effed up. I can't put a shoe on. I'm just like so fucked up. So I'm get in the bath, take a bath, and I haven't slept yet. No sleep at all. And so we got to get on a plane too. So I'm calling.
How many hours does it take to run?
So I would have finished in under 24 hours. It ended up taking me 26 hours. So because of all the issues I was having. So I'm crawling around. He comes back. I'm changing. He goes, "What are you doing?" I said, "Do you know where my ultra running magazine is?" And he goes, "Why?" And I'm like, "Well, because I want to see when the next 100-miler is, because I'm not sure if I liked it. I got to do another one." And he's like, "You have lost your mind." And my mom, even when I got home, like she saw my feet and how I couldn't walk, and like she goes, "You're going to run another one of these? I thought it was a one and done thing." And I'm like, "Oh no, I'm doing another one." So
what is it about your personality that you're so driven or crazy?
Early on, it wasn't like that. I feel like because I got sober and I feel like I got a second lease on life, that I gained a purpose in life, and I didn't have that before. And I'm just driven because the fact that I got a second lease on life, and I'm only here one time, and there's so many things I want to do. I just like keep doing more and more and more. I'm
not questioning because I'm similar, but do you have kids? Do you have children?
No, I don't. I have dogs.
You have dogs.
And I'm glad I never did, and I had been pregnant before.
Do you think you'd be a runner like this if you had kids?
No. And I think my life would have changed. I had an abortion when I was 17, and my mom wanted me to have the kid. I was with the boyfriend when my dad died, and I was like, absolutely not. And I had a few other after that because I knew, I saw my sister who is an addict, and she had 5 kids, all given up, because through her addiction. And I felt like I wasn't ready to be a mom. And I never wanted to have, when I was young, I always said, I don't want to have kids. And my mom used to say, that's selfish. You shouldn't say that. I go, but I don't want to have kids. And then I realized, like, if I did, it wouldn't have been a good life for them. Like, I saw my sister and a couple of her kids that lived with her, they ended up turning out really well. And then the other 3 were adopted out as infants, which was good. But it's like, she shouldn't have been having kids.
So how many of these ultra marathons have you run, or marathons and everything?
So marathons, I ended up only running like maybe 35, 40 marathons. But ultra marathons, I have run 340 ultra marathons.
And these are how long?
So from 50K to 240 miles. But I have run over 100, or I have run 156 of them have been 100 miles or more. And my favorite distance is the 200-miler. But now, so I've run what's called a Triple Crown, and they're the 3 200-milers, Tahoe 200, Bigfoot in Washington, and Moab 240. But next year, so the same organization, Destination Trail Racing, is putting on a 300-miler. It's called the Arizona Monster, and it's on the Arizona Trail. It's sold out in 5 days. 350 other crazy people want to do it as well. So there is no limit to what you can do.
How many days will that take?
They are giving us 9 days, I believe. So I've run 6-day races where I've done almost 400 miles. So.
Wow. Do you feel like the passion you have for running is really just a replacement for the addiction?
Of course.
Yeah.
You know, people say, oh, you're substituting an addiction. But, you know, it's a positive thing. Like, it's not, you know, drugs affected me differently, you know, when you're going after that kind of addiction. If something happens and I can't run, you know, that's okay. I'm not going to, you know, there's been times, but not in the last 12 years. I've been on this running streak for 12 years. And that's part of the, you know, my addictive
do you love it?
I do. You know what I love is being outside. So where I live in Bishop now, it's in the mountains, and you have beautiful scenery around you.
It's
Northern
Northern California.
Yeah, and when I lived in, it's in actually the Eastern Sierra. So it's 4 hours from LA.
By Yosemite.
Yes, yeah, close to that. So you have beauty all around you. And when I was on drugs, I didn't even notice. Like, I lived in Fremont where I ran Mission Peak after I got sober. I never noticed Mission Peak. Like, as a kid, I didn't really pay attention. But when I was on drugs, I never saw that. Driving back and forth to Fremont, like visiting my mom, and I never noticed Mission Peak. Once I got sober, literally, like when I moved back to Fremont, I saw it. I was like, oh, Mission, look at that. We have a big mountain here. I didn't even notice it, you know? And so being outdoors, there's been times, you know, that I haven't wanted to go run, and I'll bring up when my dog passed away, but I know if I get outside, it's going to change my perception of how I feel, and then you feel better. It's just a matter of taking that step, getting out that door. You know, it helps your mental health is what it, for me personally, it helps my mental stability, because I suffer from depression, anxiety. I think I have ADHD, you know, a little bit. You know, and I've had PTSD from things that happened.
Well, you're not hurting anybody.
No, and I'm not. So, you know, so I got really into my whole running, the 100-miler. So I started doing all these hundreds and not really thinking about it, you know, and in and out of different relationships with people. I even dated guys that were like, you run too much, and they were ultra runners. And I was like, okay, whatever, you know. And
how's your health?
You know, what's that?
How's your health?
Pretty good. I have mitral valve prolapse, but I was born with it, and it's not really affecting me at all. Like, my cardiologist I've been seeing since they diagnosed me with it, I want to say in 2007, he said, you were born with it, because my mom did have it. And it's just your flap doesn't open correctly, because he's like, do you ever feel tired or this and that? And I go, yeah, in a 100-mile and a 200-mile race, everybody feels like they're going to pass out. Everybody's, you know, feels like that, you know. And so I see the cardiologist once a year for echocardiogram, and then, you know, I stopped going twice a year, because I don't need to just go there for him to ask me questions. How are you feeling? Like, that's basically what he does. And
You're how old now?
Me? I'm 59.
59. Mm-hmm. You look great for 59.
Thank you. It's running, and it's good skincare for sure.
Yeah,
and
your skin is beautiful.
Thank you. You know, and it's all about, like, somebody told me long ago when I started running ultras, an older woman, she's like, make sure you use sunscreen, you should wear a hat, and you should wear glasses. And so I always did that, and always good sunscreen, good skincare I use too. And I'm vegan. So I think clean eating definitely shows, you know, and thank God, I mean, being on meth, some of my teeth did fall out in the back and stuff like that, but it could have been way worse, because I see friends that are my age, even though they're not doing it, but they did it a lot longer than I did, their skin doesn't look good. Like, my sister looked much older than what she was, just because of how hard living on the streets and that lifestyle. And you know, you notice when people get sober, they do end up looking better. Like, you see pictures of people, like even me, I looked older when I was younger, and I didn't look happy.
Yeah, exercise like what you're doing does something to your skin and body and everything.
It for sure does.
Makes you younger.
Yeah, it for sure does. So I started doing all these 100-milers, and I was, you know, like, when did I finish my 100th 100-miler? So I want to say 2012. I was getting close to have competing 100-mile races. And so there was only one other woman. She was a Canadian woman that had achieve that. And I was the first American woman to do it. Now,
You ran how many?
So, well, now I think I'm at like 100 miles or more. So
You've run 100-mile races.
or more 156 times. I have run 340 ultra marathons, so 50K to 200 plus miles. So now, when I got to that goal, I was the first American woman. Now there's probably about 20 people now that have reached that, and there's probably about 8 women now. So there's a lot more of us. But I was getting close, and I was like, oh, I should do this, and I went through a breakup, and I'm like, I'm going to go ahead and, and just keep going until I get to 100 milers. And I was like 80, 85, so. Oh, I have to backtrack. I was married once.
I was going to ask you about relationships.
So, yeah. So I had been, after my mom died.
You're not running away from love or something
No.
like that.
So after my mom died, I started training in Yosemite. So it was like a 4-hour drive, and I was kind of just trying to do what, to find myself and just to get through that. And me and my sister ended up acquiring the house together. We bought my brother out, and my sister Peggy, who was the drug addict. So when my mom passed away, my mom luckily made a living trust and specifically wrote in there, you guys could give money to Peggy for treatment, and if she's sober for 3 years, she gets her remainder money, and I'm just so thankful my mom was thinking ahead about stuff like that. So we told my sister, she was like, you guys owe me money, you guys are ripping me off kind of thing, you got this is my house too, and none of it was hers unless she got sober. So we told her, we're more than happy to pay for whatever program, because my mom spent easily $60,000 trying to get her in recovery, and the longest she went was about a year, and then she'd end up with the same boyfriend or back with the heroin addicts. And
What do you think the difference is between you and your sister?
that she didn't find a passion. She didn't find something to occupy her time, and she kept going back to those same people. So I had to isolate myself, and I had no friends. There was a period of my life that I got away from all those people. It was a lonely time until I started eventually meeting other runners and found my tribe, basically. And she often asked me, she goes, what is the difference between me and you? And I watched her one time before she went into the program. They said she had to detox, and watching somebody detox, I was like, she is out of her mind. She was screaming, and it's not pretty, and I hear it's horrible. It looked horrible, that what she was going through. And then she got through it and ended up in this program for, I want to say it was almost a year. And she was working and helping people, and then went back. The guy got out of jail, and back to that, And she ended up passing away 2 years after my mom. So she was wanting all this money, and we're like, no, we will put you in a program, and once you're clean and sober, then, but she was like, you guys are ripping me off, and she would come to the house, and finally we got to the point where, like, you can't come here anymore. You're not welcome here. If you want money, you got to get sober. And I always felt bad about that. It was my oldest sister that was like, she hated her because she was a drug addict. But I'm like, you can't hate your sister, but for whatever reason, they were closer in age, and they had whatever problems they had growing up together. And I always felt like when she was disappeared, I'm like, I wonder what she's doing, where's she at, And I knew she was living on the streets, and she was so nice, though, too. She would give you the shirt off of her back. She was always so nice. She'd introduce me, when she'd be with these drug addicts. If I'd see her somewhere in town, she'd be like, this is my sister. She's an ultra runner. She runs 100 miles. She was so proud of what I was doing. But she'd ask me, she's like, I don't know why I can't do it. And I said, well, you got to find something, She lost everything. She lost her kids, and I feel like when you're that down, and then her mom dies, and then she doesn't have money. Well, we're not going to give a drug addict money because we know what happens. She would have killed herself a lot faster. So she was in and out of jail, and she got out of jail apparently because we hadn't been talking to her for a year. Was the last time we seen her, and she was in a hotel room and died. The drug addicts probably could have saved her, but they're like, okay, we're leaving this place now. She's ODing. We'll come back and call the cops or whatever then. So, yeah, the police came, and when they knocked on the door, I knew, like, if the police ever came, I knew, like, she was going to be dead. Like, that would be the only way they'd come, And so knew right away, and they said, do you want to come identify her? And so we sent my cousin, because I didn't want to remember, like, see what kind of condition and how bad she looked. I didn't want to remember her like that. I saw my mom, and she didn't look bad, and my dad, but I just didn't want to see my sister or how bad she looked.
So back to your running. Running super long distances like this, does your body get super sore and break down?
Sometimes. Actually, the longer you go, so running like 200 milers is more of, I always tell people, it's more like you're doing a backpacking with not carrying a heavy pack, and you're running in between aid stations, and you have aids set up there so you don't have to carry all your food and tents and stuff like that. They have sleep stations out there. You recover faster because you're not pushing as hard as you do in a shorter distance up to 100 miles. You push hard, but then you're done and over. You have to take care of yourself nutrition-wise. When you're in a 200-mile mountain race, that they give you up to like 110 hours to finish. So you're out there multiple days. You got to factor in sleep. You need to sleep, otherwise you're hallucinating like as if you're on meth, like you're seeing all kinds of crazy shit. So you got to take care of yourself, because you're going 20 miles, sometimes 25 miles in between getting to the aid station where you get food. So you sit down, you come into an aid station, and they're like, what do you want? I'm vegan, and I'm gluten-free. And I'm like, I want a vegan burger, with some tomato and mustard and ketchup and whatever on it, and they prepare it there. Instead of like in a 100-mile race, they'll have a bunch of little snacky things already sitting out, because it's not like days where people are coming through. Like, later on in a 200-mile race, I finished like sometimes a day ahead of the last finisher, so they prepare things when you come in. And so you sit, which people have a hard time, like when they're like, I could never run 200 miles, and they've run 100 miles. I go, no, you have to get your mind wrapped around how this works. So you sit, you eat tons of calories, and you're usually climbing up a hill. So it's not like you're running, with all this heavy food in you. You're hiking up a hill, and so it's digesting, and then you're just taking gels, and, I'll take a couple of corn tortillas and hummus wraps, and then I'm surviving off of like gels and shot blocks, or these little chewy things, and then that'll sustain me, until I get to the next aid station.
Do you think there's anything negative about what you're doing? Some negative aspect to it? You're running from something?
Well, staying awake for multiple days is probably...
Not the health aspects, but just like, is there something psychological that you are unable to deal with or something like that?
No, it helps me, actually. Being out there, it helps me like plan things and think about things, and I reflect on life a lot. So people are like, what do you think about when you're running and being out in the wilderness all that time?
I mean, I've run, but not as much as you.
But when you're out there, it's
a hallucinogenic that's in a good way.
Yes, and you're just like thinking of things like, oh, I want to do this with my life or that with my life. And a lot of times when I'm struggling, I go, let's go back to your past and how you got here. And I'll just remember all the good things when you're a little kid. And I try to have my first memories, and I'll do stuff like that in my head, and trying to remember all the fun time, when my dad was here and how proud he would be watching me do what I do. So, and I try to think positive, because what happens in these long races, it's so easy to quit because you get negative and you really aren't having a problem. But in your head, that little voice is like, oh, this is bad for you. Your knee is hurting. You're messing your knee up. That's not good. When all the reality is you just need to get to the next aid station, take a little break, maybe take a nap, and then continue on. So I always remember, like, if I feel like I want to quit, I go get to that next aid station, see how you feel. If you're still having a stomach issue and you haven't, got it under control with ginger and things like that, then, if it's getting worse, then there's a reason to stop, But most of the time it's just little things that your mind makes it bigger, and it's really not that big of a thing, because something's going to hurt, and then later on the foot's going to hurt, or this is going to hurt, or your shoulder's going to hurt from carrying your pack. So, and I've gotten to aid stations where I go, hey, how's it going? And they're like, oh, I'm done. And I'm like, what do you mean you're done? You paid a lot of money to be here, because it's not cheap to run 200 miles. Those races are more expensive, but it's not I mean, 100-mile races are like $400, $500, some $600. But I mean, running 200 miles is only like $1,500 or $1,300, depends when you sign up for it. But I go, hey, are you sure? Why don't you just eat something and go out with me? Let's get to the next aid station. So, and I'm more seasoned. A lot of the times these people this is their first 200, or they've only run a couple of them. But I've done that distance 22 times, so I know that they're having a moment, but if you could just help shift them, and I feel like that's my purpose, being out and doing stuff like this is just to help others, understand. And I'm like, let's just eat something, I'll wait for you, and you work as a team out there too. It's funny because at night it gets pretty lonely, and if you don't have a pacer, you're allowed to have what's called a pacer, somebody to join you through certain parts of the race. So usually in a 200-miler, you can start picking up a pacer around 80 miles into it. And so you can have various people meet you at locations, and so they're there for your safety.
200-miler takes how many days?
It depends, but usually they give you like 109, 110 hours to finish. So like 4 days? I don't know.
Over 4 days.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the last person finishing. And that's with sleep. You got to remember they're factoring all that into it too.
Catra, one more question. What would you say you've learned from all of this?
That I'm tougher than I thought I was, and that it's given me confidence for sure. But it's I never, looking back, being young, I never thought I would be. It's made me be badass, I guess. That's a way to put it, because everybody always says you're so badass. But I'm like, is that a thing? But you know what? Yeah, it gave me so much confidence coming from being on drugs and being abused and being in this horrible relationship. I had no self-confidence.
Well, you clearly stand out.
Yeah, and I do.
In a crowd of people, you stand out.
I know. People will look at me and they're like, oh, I love your outfit. Are you going to like a rape? And I go, no, this is a running outfit. I'm in a running, everything I have on is running clothes. This is what I run in. And I'm known for that. Like this eccentric, I guess. I don't know.
You're colorful.
When I started running and I got away from that whole goth thing and dyed my hair red and started, being more colorful, I wanted to be so far away from the black and white person that I was. So I started wearing lots of color. And then I was like, you know what? They don't have, back when I started running, they didn't have cute running clothes. So, I started kind of coming up with my own thing. I would take apart shorts and make them into skirts. And now they have all these really cool running skirts that are cute and colorful outfits. And I meet a lot of other women, and they're like, you know what? You make us feel confident about wearing color. Like some people are a little bit like, oh, that's too much, But no, I want to wear color, And I go, I do it because it makes me happy. I go, and I know it makes other people happy when I'm out there. They say, we always smile and you always look so cute. We see you and we like the way you look. And I like being fashionable. I've always been into looking cool and being the cool girl here,
You're amazing. Thank you so much, Catra.
Thank you.
All right.